I'm Pat O'Haron from the Office of Planning and Program Development, and you're about to see a slideshow that was put together to illustrate one of the projects we've been working on here for the last 18 months. It's called the Cumulative Effects Carrying Capacity Project, and what we hope to do is to provide you, the public, with information that we've collected through your county commissioners and the Office of Planning and Policy Development that will help guide growth in the near future if you are willing to provide some input to the county commissioners as they make decisions in the near future. You'll be seeing a great deal of information, some of it interesting to you, some of it may not be. But what we'd ask you to do is to carefully look at what your future may be here in Missoula County and help us decide as planners in Missoula County how you would like to see rural areas of Missoula County develop, whether that be in the Frenchtown area or 9 Mile or Seeley Lake or Condon, Potomac, Clearwater, or if you'd simply like to see things happen however they might happen without any type of direction or control or regulation. Let us know that too, because what's important here is that the information get out to you, members of the public, and that you then provide input back to the county on how you would like to see Missoula County look in the next 20 to 30 years.
This slideshow was put together to be presented to different organizations so that we could let Missoulians know that Missoula County was working on a project which would help to direct where the growth that was occurring, where the growth would go. And the slideshow is a fascinating example of what we can do with current technology and in helping us to determine where growth can go. And it's also fascinating to see the wildlife that exists in Missoula County and what we have done with the information to protect that wildlife. Approximately 2 years ago, employees of Missoula County's Rural Planning Office noted that significant growth was occurring in Missoula County and suggested to the commissioners that a study be conducted to determine both the cumulative effects of that growth and the carrying capacity of Missoula County for further growth. As a result, we have this slideshow which shows some of the results of that project. Shortly after I began working on this project in the fall of 1993, someone left this cartoon on my desk. What it says is, I've always had this dream of buying a little farm and then selling it off piece by piece. What we noticed in Missoula County is that this is what is occurring, or one of the things that is occurring in the land divisions and the growth of development in Missoula County. The purpose of the project was initially to protect conservation resources where appropriate. So we needed to determine what resources existed and which ones we wanted to maintain. The other part of the project was to identify areas where development should be encouraged, acknowledging that there would be resources that we would have to be willing to lose. The assumptions that we began the project with are first that growth will continue, and later in the slideshow, Pat will have some data that indicates that that is the case. The other assumption that we made is that we cannot control growth. We may be able to direct where growth occurs, but we will not be able to control growth. We can't close the gate. We can't tell people they can't have children. Growth will continue in Missoula County. The other thing that we discovered was that in looking at different ways to direct where growth would occur, we were limited in the regulations that we could use. Zoning provides in counties that if you attempt to zone a particular parcel or several parcels, 40% of the people who live in the zoning district can protest and eliminate your ability to zone. So our use of zoning we felt was going to be ineffective. The other thing that we looked at were the land divisions that had occurred prior to the 1993 changes made in the legislature to the Subdivision and Platting Act. And what those changes did, among other things, was redefine what a subdivision, an exemption from subdivision review is. Prior to 1993, you could divide land in Missoula County or anywhere in Montana into parcels of 20 acres or greater without undergoing review. The state legislature changed that to 160 acres, so that brought a lot more land under review through the subdivision regulations. The legislature also eliminated the occasional sale exemption, which was used in Missoula County to divide a lot of land up and create subdivisions that hadn't undergone review. So we began to look at the subdivision regulations as a place where we could make some changes in the regulatory structure so that we could direct where growth was to occur. This slide illustrates the regulatory structure within Missoula County. 88.8% of Missoula County has no building permit jurisdiction or zoning regulations. That was another piece of information that indicated to us that zoning regulations were not going to be the place where we would make any impact in making changes in those regulations. Our implementation consisted of first looking at the subdivision regulations, and we called those our project building blocks. We looked at the regulations in a three-phase process, and the first two phases of that review are completed. The first phase was an effort to change the regulations so that they complied with those 1993 changes that the state legislature made, and those changes were mandatory and required to be implemented by September 30th of 1993. Phase 2 of the project looked at some model regulations that were written by the Montana Department of Commerce. We compared those regulations to Missoula County's and took the best of the Department of Commerce regulations and put them into our regulations. Phase 3 of the project was an attempt to implement the information we had received in the cumulative effects carrying capacity project and make changes in the regulations that would direct growth in a way that would conserve resources and also provide other standards for subdivisions that would be developed in Missoula County. For instance, we recently implemented fire standards for developments which occur in the wildfire urban interface so that we can protect both the forests in those areas and folks who choose to build in forested areas. At the same time, the health department was looking at sanitation regulations to determine the appropriate place for septic systems or for expansion of the sewer system. We also looked at countywide development permits, which is something that is still being studied to determine whether it's appropriate. We're looking at countywide building permits as a means of implementing the other regulations. We are also looking at special conservation resource guidelines, and some of those have been implemented. And finally, we're looking at development incentives so that when we identify those areas where development is appropriate, we can provide the developer with incentives so that he will want to develop in those areas. The elements of the project, as I said, include looking at conservation resources that exist in Missoula County and identifying those that exist and where they exist. Another element was to look at water quality issues and to look at air quality issues and to look at the current infrastructure to determine the carrying capacity for additional growth in Missoula County. This project has had the cooperation of several agencies both within Missoula County and outside of the county, including private contractors. The health department has been involved to the extent of looking at water quality issues and air quality issues and looking at their own regulations. The rural planning office has been involved in identifying conservation resources and helping to identify means of implementing changes to the regulations. The Missoula County Surveyor's Office has provided technical assistance by way of mapping the land divisions which have occurred in Missoula County, and they have provided us with very valuable information. The Office of Community Development has been helpful in revising the subdivision regulations. The County Attorney's Office has reviewed the regulations and made recommendations for changes to regulations and new regulatory structures which will help to determine what kind of regulation we can affect in the county. We also have several private contractors who have provided us with GIS information,
satellite imagery, water quality studies, and we also have entered into memoranda of understanding with state, federal, and private agencies, which have become very important to us. These agencies have reviewed our proposed regulations and our data to determine that we are on track, identifying what needs to be protected in Missoula County, and whether we are doing it in a way that will result in protection to conservation resources. Without these folks, we wouldn't be able to have the review of wildlife biologists and those kinds of experts that we cannot have on staff at Missoula County because of economic constraints, and those agreements have been invaluable in this project. Probably the most important change that we have made to the subdivision regulations is to implement riparian standards. When we were first studying what the conservation resources are in Missoula County, it was apparent that we needed to protect areas of riparian resource in Missoula County. And we looked at several ways that we could do that. Our first idea was to protect what we described as a jurisdictional definition of a riparian area. And in May of 1994, the Missoula County Commissioners passed what we referred to as interim riparian regulations, which did not allow subdivisions or development to occur within 50 feet of an area of riparian resource. And we defined an area of riparian resource basically as waterway, wetlands, streams, lakes, wherever something was holding water. When we took this out to those various agencies that were reviewing our data, they told us that while this was a good way to define areas of riparian resource, they felt that our regulations would be more meaningful if we could establish a functional definition of a riparian area. It was recommended to us that the best way to do that was to identify vegetation that grows in areas of riparian resource and thrives there, and to define that as our area of protection. As a result, in December of 1994, the Missoula County Commissioners revised the subdivision regulation standards which protect areas of riparian resource, defining that area with a functional definition. What this slide illustrates is that in a particular development that has perhaps a body of water and vegetation that would exist in an area of riparian resource, the area of protection might not be a straight line or a circular line around a body of water. It may be 5 feet from the body of water. It may be a half a mile from the body of water, and that area would be subject to protection through subdivision review. This slide illustrates the importance of having a functional definition. This is a homeowner in Missoula County who had cottonwood trees between his lawn and the Rattlesnake Creek, and he decided to remove that vegetation so that he could have a better view of the creek. If the impact of his taking this kind of action was, at least for that season, detrimental to Rattlesnake Creek. There was increased sedimentation in the creek, and it flooded the area that he was hoping to plant in lawn. And it's something that we are hoping that we can, through our building blocks of the subdivision regulations, get to a point that we can educate landowners and provide regulations so that something like this will not occur in the future. This is another example of development within an area of riparian resource. This home was built on the Swan River, and it was built very close to the river. It was built without obtaining a floodplain permit, and when it was determined that the house was there, it was in a rather remote area, an attempt was made to contact the landowner to determine whether the area was in the floodplain. And what's important is that whether it is in the floodplain or not, this is an area of riparian resource. And you can see by the way the bank is cut in this slide that the house should not be this close to the river, and development should not occur in the area of the resource. And all of the other ways in which this resource functions will not will not be protected as a result of the development. And if we find that this area is not in the floodplain, without further regulation, this house will be able to be built and exist basically on the banks of the river. This is my last slide in my portion of the presentation, and it was originally placed in our slideshow about a year ago when we were presenting to the Audubon Society. And we were working on our riparian regulations at the time, and Pat O'Hearn let me know that there would be a slide in my part of the presentation of Canada geese. I didn't know what Canada geese were, so when we talked to Audubon, I said, gee, this looks like those ducks behind Bilo. And there were audible gasps that came from the crowd. What it is attempting to illustrate is the importance of an area of riparian resource to those guys that are floating in the river or are in that wetland, who apparently are Canada geese and are not the ducks behind Bilo.
As Colleen mentioned, this slide illustrates some of the functions and values of riparian areas, not only in Missoula County, but throughout the world. And as you can see, we have both water storage here, but we also have some filtering back here in this cattail area. There is agricultural use in the back, and the cattails form a real nice buffer in terms of runoff and that sort of thing. Of course, we have waterfowl production. As Colleen mentioned, these are Canada geese, and you'll notice that 2 of these geese knew that attorneys would be using this particular slide, and they let their opinion be known. Well, as most of us know, growth is occurring fairly rapidly in western Montana, although the state as a whole does not seem to be experiencing rapid growth. In western Montana, from Flathead Lake, Missoula, and Ravalli County reports, we're seeing that growth, in fact, is not only rapid, but it's also having impacts that were not necessarily anticipated. And what we're trying to do at this point is to prepare ourselves for growth so that we don't catch ourselves in a bind, kind of like this little guy did, and actually outgrow our living environment. We've looked at a number of indicators to give us some idea of what kind of rate of growth we are experiencing in Missoula County. City building permits, which are only within the city limits or within 4.5 miles of those city limits, are one indicator. And if you look at this chart, you'll notice that we had $8.3 million worth of building permits issued in 1993 in the first quarter. In the same quarter of 1994, we were up to $20.7 million. Other indicators that we have researched are things like rural electrical connections, and you can see in terms of the residential new services added outside of the urban area of Missoula, from the early 80s through the first part of 1991, we're in the 100 to 200 degree range, but we jumped up to 476 new connections in 1992, and that held true in 1993 also. We don't have the 1994 data yet, but our guess is that we will be seeing the same sort of increase that we saw between 1991 and 1992. Of course, one of the most widely used indicators of growth is census data. And in 1992, the Census Bureau released figures for Missoula County and others counties in Montana that indicated that our growth rate between 1990 and 1992 was 4.7%. So in 1992, we had about 82,000 people in Missoula County. If we projected out at the same growth rate that the Census Bureau says we were experiencing between 1990 and 1992, then by the year 2012, we'll have about 130,000 people in Missoula County. And there is some caution that goes with these kind of projections. First, we may have a lower growth rate than 4.7, in which case we wouldn't get up to the 130,000 mark. On the other hand, we may have a higher growth rate, one more in tune with what we're seeing with building permits, for instance, or rural telephone connections, or rural electrical connections, or even enrollments in schools in rural areas and even in the urban area. But what we've done is used the more conservative population projection of 4.7% so that we're not alarmist in this particular aspect of the Carrying Capacity Cumulative Effects project. In order to document what some of the impacts of growth are, whether they be growth rates of 4.7% or 40.7%, one of the tools that we're using is the surveyor's office in trying to map all of the different land splits that have occurred in Missoula County. But before we do that, This particular slide gives you an indication of the geographic boundaries of Missoula County and the land ownership within the county. This is the Swan Valley up in this area here. So this is the Missoula County, Lake County line up by Condon, Montana. This is the tribal lands within the external boundaries of the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes. Our Lee, Montana would be right about here, just outside the county boundary. This is the 9-mile area of Missoula County. Lolo is right here. This is Lolo Creek, and Lolo Pass is right in this area here. This is the lower end of the Bitterroot Valley. The Clark Fork River comes into the urban area of Missoula through this corridor here. This is the Blackfoot River corridor, this being the Potomac area, Clearwater Junction, and the Seeley Lake community in western Montana. The colors here represent, again, the tribes here in red. This kind of Pepto-Bismol color is Plum Creek lands. Plum Creek is the largest private property owner in Missoula County. They own about 60.3% of all of the private land in Missoula County. Green is under Forest Service management, either the Flathead Forest up here or Lolo in this area, or a little small piece of the Bitterroot National Forest down in this area. This is the urban area of Missoula in this kind of ochre color. The blue is state lands in Missoula County. Well, if you'll notice the white here, the white is land that is currently occupied, or owned by the private sector and is non-corporate in nature. In other words, Plum Creek land is also private, but they are so significant in their land holdings that we gave them their own color. The white here is private non-corporate land in Missoula County. Well, what we've done is go to the surveyor's office and ask them if they would map for us all of the existing land divisions in Missoula County so that we can see how the private property owner in these areas might like to see the future of their land develop. As you can see on this slide, which is simply a compilation of all the material we had from the previous slide, with the addition of all of the land divisions in Missoula County on private non-corporate land, and they are then colored in teal. So you can see that virtually all of the formerly white area here is now shown in teal, and that's because basically all of the county is divided up into smaller parcels than one just large chunk. We are now zooming into a smaller area of the overall county. This shows the area west of Missoula out towards Fort Missoula and the Big Flat and Blue Mountain areas. In fact, this is Blue Mountain down here at the bottom of the screen. Big Flat is up in this area. Kelly Island is right here, and we have the Clark Fork River and the Bitterroot River shown here. All of these smaller lines are little drainages that empty into the Clark Fork or the Bitterroot, and in fact this is O'Brien Creek out west of Missoula. What we're going to do next is look at all of the land divisions that have occurred out here. So basically all we're doing is taking that large county map and zooming in on a portion of it so that we can see better where some of those land divisions are occurring, what their size is, and what maybe the property owner would like to see their land look like in the future. I draw your attention to two areas, one right here in the center of the slide and the other one up here in the upper left-hand corner. This again is Plum Creek ownership up here. This is private, non-corporate land, and this of course is managed by the Forest Service here in green. What we've done now is drop all of the land divisions that have occurred out in this area onto the slide, and they are again in teal here. We've also added all of the existing roads in yellow. So right here we have O'Brien Creek. This blue area is Blue Mountain Recreation Area. This is the Clark Fork. Kelly Island would be right here. This is the Bitterroot River as it comes in. As you can see, most of the land is pretty well divided up in this area. And also up in here in the Plum Creek area, you can see that the land is already fairly heavily eroded. And then the question becomes for Plum Creek as a property owner, is the best use of this land for timber in the future, for timber management and harvesting, or would it be best, given its location so close to the urban area and all of these existing land divisions, perhaps Plum Creek would like to see this also divided up and sold so that it can be used to house some of the future people that will be coming to Missoula. And again, if you hearken back to the projections from the Census Bureau, we'll be adding roughly 50,000 more people in the next 18 years. The question then becomes, where do we want to see those people live? Perhaps right in here is a good area to do so. We're now in the 9-mile area of Missoula County. Again, green shows forest managed lands, white is private non-corporate, and this is Plum Creek. And over here on the far right, we have a small portion of the tribal lands that are shown. Again, we're going to drop over all of the land divisions that are found in this area so you get some idea of what property owners might like to see their land look like in the very near future. As you can see, most of the lower 9-mile is already divided up. We have some subdivisions here that are showing up in a little yellow color rather than in teal, but they show the same thing, very small parcels of land. And even if you look over in here into the land that is on the Flathead Reservation, you'll notice that it is also heavily divided up. Well, virtually any place we go to in Missoula County, we find the same sort of future for Missoula County in terms of private property and whether or not it is divided. We are now east of the city of Missoula. This darker area is Plum Creek. The lighter blue here indicates state lands. If you would keep your eye on this half section of state land right here, it is now right here on the slide, but we've also dropped over all of the land divisions and the roads in this area. This is the Potomac Valley of Missoula County, and as you come around the major bend in the highway here, Johnsrid Park would be in this area, and as you come around the bend and you look out into this what is currently mostly agriculture and timber, you'll see that the private property owners in the area don't necessarily think that that's what the future of the Potomac Valley will look like, and in fact most of it is pretty heavily divided for home sites or small businesses or whatever they would like to see in the future. In terms of the future of Missoula County and how its land is utilized, there are obviously many options. All of those options have certain impacts, whether they be recreational development or housing development. In this particular case, in a campsite in a riparian area, we can see that we've had a fair amount of displacement of vegetation here. We have also had species displacement of wildlife. For instance, while elk, deer, moose, and some others formerly may have used this for forage or thermal cover or hiding cover, they no longer do so, primarily because of our presence. That doesn't mean that we can't coexist and that we can't have certain areas like this for recreation, but it does mean that we have to be very well aware of our impacts and what choices we're making. When we decide to put a campground in an area such as this, rather than a home site, we have to recognize our impacts and try to keep a cumulative total of those impacts, and that's one of the jobs of the Cumulative Effects Carrying Capacity Project. While we have recreation impacts in some areas, riparian areas are also heavily impacted by human development. And in fact, one of the most desirable areas to live in western Montana is on either a water frontage site or on a site that has good views. And as you can see, this is in the urban area of Missoula, and what the realtor is advertising here is not necessarily what type of home, but simply that the home is in fact on the creek. Again, this is an advertisement for a subdivision in the urban area of Missoula that is also in a riparian area. And as you can see, the advertisement notes that Brookside, which is the name of the subdivision, is osprey catching fish, deer with fawns in the morning and evening, woodpeckers, raccoons, the sounds of rippling water. What's interesting from a planning perspective is that, now we have a riparian area that is valuable not only to these wildlife species, but also to the economy of Missoula, not only to the realtor, but also the landowner, and certainly to the future homeowners of the area. The question then becomes, can we develop subdivisions such as Brookside in a manner that protects all of these resources, provides us with a good quality living environment, and helps the economy at the same time? We think after some of the data that we've reviewed through this particular project that in fact we can do that. In terms of riparian areas and their importance to conservation, this is Rufous hummingbird. And Rufous is one of what we call neotropical migrants. He has a very, I think, enviable lifestyle to many of us. He winters in Costa Rica and summers up here in western Montana. He is one of about 50% of our avian species, or he represents about one of 50% of our avian species that are called riparian obligates. In other words, they are obliged to use riparian areas or they cannot survive. About 98% of all of our bird species use riparian areas to some extent, and about half, or 48% of them, are riparian obligates. Of course, we have other species besides avian species that utilize our riparian and upland areas. This is a photograph of a lynx, and the photograph was taken early in the morning, about 4 a.m., when the lynx tripped a self-portrait, if you will. This is part of an infrared camera system, and when the lynx walked through the beam here, he managed to take his own picture. 4 a.m. in the morning, he's kind of starry-eyed, as I think most of us would be. But if you'll also notice out here, there are a number of other tracks in the snow, including this trail right here, which is a cross-country ski trail. So we can have the use of areas by sensitive species such as the lynx, as well as deer, moose, elk, and of course human beings, if we do it and do it well and recognize the impacts. Of course, we won't have the lynx out here in the middle of the day if we have big crowds on trails like this. On the other hand, if we have seldom used trails or direct people away from certain areas, we can keep a species, a sensitive species such as the lynx, and human use at the same time. Lynx are a sensitive species and are recognized as such in the state of Montana. There is a trapping season on lynx, but the limit is 2 for any 1 year. The lynx has also been petitioned nationwide for inclusion as a threatened and endangered species under the Endangered Species Act. Other species of special concern in Missoula County and western Montana include this little critter, which most of us have never seen in the wild, let alone had any real working relationship with. This is the fisher. And the fisher was very important to Montana's economy, particularly in the 1930s during the Depression, when it was very valuable as a fur bear. Unfortunately, we did not take too good of care of its habitat, and we over-trapped it to a certain extent, and currently the fisher is also one of those species of special concern that will probably be petitioned for listing as a threatened and endangered species due to its limited numbers and its diminished habitat. Of course, it's important to maintain a variety of species for a number of reasons, but one of the more important ones seems to be these days the economy, and the question becomes, should we maintain species like the fisher so that we can continue a viable trapping industry in Montana, or should we let them go extinct and let that particular portion of the diversity of our economy go with them? Fishers were reintroduced in a part of northwestern Montana about 6 years ago, and that reintroduction was very unsuccessful and somewhat costly. We are seeing the reintroduction of other species, and of course the major item on the front page of the newspaper these days has been the reintroduction of the gray wolf, a very expensive project, but one that nationwide has seemed to be one of grave importance to most of the population. The question then becomes, is it less expensive to reintroduce, or is it less expensive to keep species like the gray wolf or the fisher here in the first place? The grizzly bear is one of 4 threatened and endangered species in Missoula County, the other 3 being the bald eagle, the peregrine falcon, and the gray wolf. The grizzly occupies a fairly large portion of Missoula County, and we have a viable population in part of that occupied territory. We are losing grizzly bears in some portions of the Missions and the Swan Valley, although there is a concerted effort on the part of landowners in the area in conjunction with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the Forest Service to address problems of human-bear conflict, as well as trying to protect the habitat so that the bear is not lost in that area. Of course, the bear is important not only as a species of special concern or threatened and endangered species nationwide, it's also of importance to human beings for economic reasons as well. The former hunting season that was conducted in Montana for grizzly bears was very popular outside of the state, brought in a significant amount of money. If the bear is recovered, there is every reason to believe that that hunting season will be reestablished. We also know that the bear has some remarkable characteristics that are extremely valuable to humans in terms of how the bear is able to hibernate for 6 to 8 months out of the year and not suffer any kidney damage. What it is able to do is maintain bone mass so it does not have problems with osteoporosis. There are a number of other things that researchers are looking into that the bear can do very successfully that we are not quite as adept at. And again, as I mentioned, there is the economic value as well as the scenic and wildlife tourism values that the bear offers. Well, as much as it's interesting to look at species like fisher and rufous hummingbird and others, it's equally important to look at the human species in terms of conservation resources, cumulative effects, and carrying capacity projects. This is a slide of the Missoula urban area in the lower Rattlesnake. Interstate 90 overpass is right here. This is the lower end of the Blue Mountain Recreation Area, and up here is Lolo Peak. Of course, if we want to preserve a viable elk population, which happens to winter in this area here, or if we would like to continue recreational activities on the flanks of Lolo Peak, or if we just want to have the scenic backdrop that Lolo Peak offers for the community of Missoula, we must deal with one species in particular, and that's you and I, the human species. Where we put our schools, where we put our infrastructure in terms of roads, utilities, sewers, all of those sorts of things will determine, in fact, whether or not this elk herd survives here, whether or not this larch community right up here on the flank of Mormon Ridge, or whether or not we have a four-season destination resort on Lolo Peak. Those are all choices that will be made in the very near future by the species that drives vans and school buses, not by the elk, not by fisher or rufous hummingbird. So where we put our infrastructure is at least as important to look at as is things like the Endangered Species Act, or which species have been important to the economy of Montana 50 years ago versus those which will be important to us in the next 3 to 500 years. As Colleen mentioned, this project started about 18 months ago, and one of the reasons why it's feasible at this time and was not feasible to do, say, 2 to 3 years ago was simply because we didn't have the technological capability to undertake it, nor did we have the tools that the legislature provided us in 1993 when they amended the subdivision regulations. Given the fact that those regulations have been amended and that we've made great technological advances in the computer world, those two elements have allowed Missoula County to move forward with a project of this scope. And one of the tools that we're using is called a GIS, or Geographic Information System. And if you think of this computer system simply as a fancy file cabinet that has 64 file folders within it, or 64 layers of data, and each of those file folders has certain information that is particular only to that file. For instance, we may have information on the utilities in Missoula County in one file. We may have information on water or bull trout or subdivisions or agricultural uses or ownership in each in a separate file somewhere else in that file folder. Well, that's not too unique, but what we can do through the use of computers is take each of those file folders and start combining them and seeing how they start looking together, and we can use that information to project what might occur into the future. Well, GIS is not new to the world. It is fairly new to county use, and Missoula County is one of the first in the western United States to utilize it for land planning purposes. We also believe that Missoula County is extremely unique in how we are going to be using GIS in the very near future. Instead of just looking at local geographic issues, we are going to be plotting social and economic data using our GIS system, putting that sort of information into file folders, and then seeing how the social, economic, and cultural development of Missoula County impacts some of the other resources, such as conservation resources, and we'll be doing that over the next 6 to 8 months. There are a number of ways that we can use computers to look at data, and this is called a digital elevation model, or DEM. And all it is simply a sampling of the Earth's surface at 30-meter intervals within Missoula County, and then building a 3D map using that information. It's as if we are now in the southeast corner of Missoula County, down in this area, and looking up into the northwest corner up out of the 9 Mile Valley. So we have the elevational range of Missoula County from the urban area, the valley bottoms here in Missoula, the city of Missoula, up to the peaks in the Rattlesnake, up through the valley in 9 Mile. You can see the colors here are what we showed earlier in terms of land ownership. So the lighter areas are private non-corporate, Plum Creek and Forest Service managed lands are in green, with the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes shown in red. We also have state land in blue. If you look at the county from this view, you get a sense of how limited the area is that is relatively flat in Missoula County. And of course, most of that flat land is privately owned. It is not controlled by state or federal agencies. Some of the technology that has been available to us for a number of years is now available to us to use in a much different manner. This is a satellite photograph that was taken of western Montana in July of 1991. Flathead Lake is at the top up here. Polson would be right in this area. You can see the Nine Pipes area right here. And we drop down further south. The community of Arlee would be in this area. This is Evero Pass, the Missoula Valley right here, 9 Mile Valley, the end of, or the northern end of the Bitterroot Valley, Lolo Creek as it exits Missoula County, the Clark Fork River as it comes in, the Blackfoot River as it enters into the area by Bonner. These are the Mission Mountains in this area, the Swan Valley here, Condon, Montana, and the northern boundary of Missoula County is right in this area. And this, of course, is the Bob Marshall Wilderness Complex. Seeley Lake would be right about here, and again, the Missoula Valley and the urban area is right in this area. Well, what we've done is taken the last slide, that digital elevation model, and combined it with satellite coverage, and we have the next slide that you'll see. When we take that satellite image and combine it with the digital elevation model, we have the real world as it existed in July of 1991 and in a perspective that we're more used to visualizing. Here we have, again, the Missoula urban area. This is Mount Sentinel right here. The M is right there. Mount Jumbo on the top portion up here where it's relatively flat. This is the Rattlesnake Valley, the Clark Fork River as it comes in through Missoula, the Bitterroot River, and Fort Missoula is right here on the bend of the Bitterroot. This is Grant Creek, Butler Creek, and Highway 93 as it goes up to Evero Hill, which is right here. The community of Arlee in the background. This line that you see going through here is a utility corridor, and it houses, among other things, the Yellowstone Pipeline. Most of us have seen information in the not-too-distant past about Yellowstone Pipeline's desire to maintain that corridor through the Flathead Reservation. Whether or not that corridor is maintained is up to some discussion because Yellowstone's lease with the tribes expires in April of this year. The question then becomes, where do we want to see the pipeline go? Should it stay in its same corridor here and through the reservation, or should it be put along Interstate 90 and go out perhaps up the 9 Mile or somewhere in that area? That certainly is a growth issue because as we get our next 50,000 people, and remember that's the conservative projection for the next 18 years, when we add those 50,000 people, where would you like to see them go? Should they go into the Rattlesnake drainage of Missoula County, or perhaps up Grant Creek, perhaps in Butler Creek, maybe on the hillsides in between, maybe on Waterworks Hill, or over in the South Hills, out by the fort? Obviously, the community has spoken in terms of development of fort lands and would not like to see those people move into an area such as the fort, but the question then is, where should we put those next 50,000 people? We're now looking at the area of Lolo in Missoula County. The community of Lolo is in this section of the slide right here. This is the hilltop development. Lolo Creek as it comes out of the mountains and joins the Bitterroot right here. Of course, Lolo Creek has been dewatered for a number of years in its lower stretches, and water no longer reaches the Bitterroot River. The question then becomes, again, where would you like to see those 50,000 people put? Should they go in the upper reaches of Lolo Creek? Should they go in the area with higher density where Lolo is currently developed? Or perhaps in the lower end of Miller Creek over in this area, or perhaps in the foothills of the Sapphires on this side of the Bitterroot River, or maybe in the riparian area or in the floodplain area of the Bitterroot. Again, those are tough questions that are going to have to be answered in the very near future if this community, if this county is going to determine how its growth will occur in the next 18 to 20 years. We are now above the community of Arlee in Lake County, looking south into Missoula County. We are looking literally south up the Bitterroot Valley here, so Hamilton is off the screen way up in this area down here. This is Lolo Peak. We have the Missoula Flats right out in here, the Missoula Valley where most of our development is occurring. Evero Hill is right here. This is Highway 93 as it heads north up towards Polson. Joe's Smoke Ring, for those of you who are familiar with it, is this area right here in light color that is in contrast to the forested areas around it. And you can see a little bit better now that utility corridor that I spoke of earlier that comes out of the Missoula Valley and heads up towards the Flathead area. This contains the Yellowstone pipeline as well as a number of other utilities. And the question again becomes, as we add people in Missoula County who are going to be using fossil fuels such as the Yellowstone pipeline carries, where are we going to want to put, for instance, terminals so that we can tap into the pipeline? Where do we want to put the pipeline itself? Where do we want to put future pipelines that will be bringing fossil fuels into the Missoula area as we continue to grow? The other thing that I'd ask you to look at in this slide, this area right here, about 1 mile in extent, lineal extent, is the last crossing that connects the Selway Bitterroot Wilderness up through the 9 Mile area over to the Rattlesnake and Mission Mountains with the Canadian ecosystem of the Northern Rockies that starts in British Columbia, comes down through Glacier Park and the Bob Marshall Wilderness. And in fact, the wolf pack in the 9 Mile area regularly use this corridor right here to cross Highway 93 to get over into the 9 Mile area. Again, think of the species of limited distribution, species of special concern, especially wide-ranging carnivores who utilize areas such as the rattlesnake and potentially, or in the past, have utilized places like the Selway Bitterroot. Do we want to maintain a corridor that allows them to cross, as it does right now here on Highway 93, and allow them to reestablish themselves in areas such as the 9 Mile and Selway Bitterroot? Or do we want to literally try to capture them and transplant them across areas such as this because we no longer allow them to cross on their own? The question is one not only of biology, but also one of economy. Today, the Montana Department of Transportation is looking at widening Highway 93 or otherwise improving it from Missoula to Polson, and this area is one of critical concern. If we put a 4-lane highway here, we can virtually assure ourselves that those species of limited distribution, the wide-ranging species of limited distribution, will no longer be able to cross here, and we will have to look at other ways of getting them from one ecosystem to another. A tough question to face because it involves things like human safety as well as biological diversity in Missoula County. We're now above Gray Wolf Mountain in the Mission Mountains of Missoula County. We're looking to the east towards the Bob Marshall Wilderness area. This is the Swan Front, Holland Lake here, Lindbergh Lake. You can see Lindbergh Lake Road and Highway 83 as it goes up north through the Swan Valley. Again, what would we like to see occur here in terms of the future of Missoula County? Past land uses, as you can see, have included timber harvest. And in fact, the Swan Valley is one of our best timber producing regions in western Montana. Certainly in Missoula County, it is our best timber producing region. The question then becomes, should we keep it in timber production? Or should we as a society decide that, well, no, let's put some of those 50,000 people that will be moving here in the next 18 years into the Swan? And in fact, we could put communities very much like Stevensville or Florence or Victor or any of those sites in the Swan Valley just as easily as they were put into the Bitterroot. Question becomes one of choices. Also, when we make those choices, we will not only be deciding between timber and subdivisions, we'll be deciding between the future of tourism and wildlife in the Swan versus the future of economic enterprises such as retail sales and hardware stores and coffee shops and that sort of thing. This linkage area between the Mission Mountains on the south side of Lindbergh Lake and the Bob Marshall Wilderness is the most critical linkage corridor for wide-ranging species of limited distribution in northern North America in terms of movement from British Columbia down through Glacier, the Bob Marshall, and over into the Mission. In fact, this is the best linkage for the grizzly bear that is currently left in western Montana that will allow it to reestablish itself without a great deal of economic investment on our part. So again, what do we want to do in the future in the Swan Valley? What do people who live there want to do? What do the corporations that are based outside of Montana want to do? And what will future residents want to do in the Swan? Well, not only can we look at satellite photographs and look at the real world as the satellite saw it from a bird's eye view, we can also look at simply data. And GIS allows us to do that in a fairly comprehensive manner. Remember, GIS is just a geographic information system that's a bunch of file folders in a computer. In this case, in Missoula County, we mapped all of the critical range for moose, elk, deer, and a number of other species. And of course, there's what is called a database attached to each of those areas so that they're not only colored, but we know where the information came from. We can tell the size of an area. In this case, it's about 12,000 hectares in size. We're querying this area right here, by the way. And the computer tells us that it is critical moose winter range, that Montana Department of Fish, Wildlife, and Parks was our source of information. So if someone comes up with a subdivision proposal that may impact this moose habitat, we can deduct an appropriate number of acres from the area, or if someone adds some moose habitat over here through revegetation or whatever, we can keep a cumulative total of all of the moose habitat or a number of other species in Missoula County as we continue to grow. We can do that for, as I mentioned, not only moose, but a number of other species, and that's where GIS will be very interesting to us when we look at social, economic, and cultural data, because we can keep a running total of some of the things that we use to measure social and economic values in Missoula County, and we'll get to that in a very few minutes. One of the other file folders is simply what's called a hydrographic file folder. It will show a number of things, such as the Bitterroot River, which is right here on the slide, where it joins the Clark Fork and then flows out of Missoula County, as well as all of the other drainages, be they the Clearwater, the Swan River, 9 Mile Creek, O'Brien Creek, Lolo Creek, those sorts of things. We're back now to a digital elevation model, and again, it's just a relief model of a portion of Missoula County. We have elevation shown here, and again, it's as if the sun were in the southeast corner of Missoula County, shining up towards the southwest corner. This is Hellgate Canyon. So the darker portions here are shaded. The lighter portions would be in sun. So this is the top of Mount Jumbo. This is the north-facing side of Hellgate Canyon, the north-facing side of Mount Sentinel. This is the fire road that crosses the front of Mount Sentinel, so the M would be here. This is the urban area. You can see all of the roads in red, and the area out towards Big Flat and Frenchtown and up towards 9 Mile. Again, all we have here is a couple of file folders that are combined, but what's interesting now is what we can start doing with the information as we combine it in terms of elevation and slope and how much sunshine an area gets versus where the roads are, where the services are, and how we can best access a site. What we've done is taken that digital elevation model and the information there and converted it from a 3D model into one that's 2D, and these white lines are simply lines of equal elevation or contour lines. So this is the top of Mount Sentinel. As the lines are closer together, the slope is much steeper, so this again is that shady portion of Hellgate Canyon, the very steep rocky cliffs. This is the top of Mount Jumbo, and right here where the arrow is pointing is a portion of Waterworks Hill where a subdivision was proposed on top of Waterworks Hill. What we can do then is drop over information such as where are the sensitive plant species. In this case, we find a phlox and an herb. Where are the sensitive animal species? Peregrine falcon out here. We can look again at things like access, visibility, all of those sorts of things depending on which file folders we have in our GIS system. What we've done now again is stand on the subdivision. This is as if you and I are at the arrow and standing in the living room of one of the potential houses that could be built on the subdivision at Waterworks Hill. And what we've done is asked the computer to color in green everything that we can see from our living room window. So this is basically the view that we would have were we to build a house and live in it up here on Waterworks Hill. The red lines again are roads. The yellow line is just the urban area of Missoula. But the most important thing to look at here again is the green. That's how much we would see if we were in the living room on this particular site. We can see out past the airport, up towards Lolo, back up towards Marshall Grade in that area. Of course, this is a very interesting tool if, for instance, you're a real estate agent. Instead of taking an individual out to every house site to see what you could see from that particular spot, you could simply sit in your office, pull up the information on the computer, and show a customer what is out there. Of course, the reverse is true also. This is kind of a double-edged sword. The next slide is going to show us how we can use the information in a much different way. Now we are standing on the Higgins Avenue Bridge and looking at Waterworks Hill, and we've colored in the area of Waterworks Hill that would be developed under the subdivision proposal. So what we have here essentially is what the view would be for the public as they looked up at formerly open space lands that have now been subdivided and will see construction in the near future. This, as I mentioned, is a double-edged sword because what we have now is an environmental community that can use GIS to say, no, we don't want to see any type of development in a particular area because it impacts our view, our surrounding views that are very important to the quality of life in Missoula County, just as the GIS tool can be used by the development community to show potential buyers where they might best get the best view. Through the initial